So I was watching Hamilton, and I was really impressed by the whole thing. But I had one particular element that stood out to me. One element that was certainly the tear-jerker part that touched my heart, and that was the part of Hamilton's story where he has an infidelity in his marriage, and then has to work through the course of a long period of time to reconcile with his wife and finally find her forgiveness.
Yeah.
And that it really, I mean, you want to see me get all teary-eyed and choked up in a movie, any movie where there's some kind of radical love, radical forgiveness. It doesn't matter if it's a Pixar cartoon or whatever it may be. I get all weepy and whatever because that just touches my heart.
Yeah.
And so I particularly thought it'd be relevant as ministers, as people who do pastoral ministry, and certainly encounter these kinds of family-breaking, life-altering sins in people's lives and try to help them through that. I mean, I wanted to reach out to Alexander Hamilton. I wanted to be able to come alongside of him and help him navigate through the mess that he had made and find God's forgiveness. And so I thought we would talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what I really saw as an analogy, and the more I thought about it, the more things popped into my mind, is that this reminds me of the story of King David.
Oh, absolutely.
In the Bible.
Yeah.
There's just several points of comparison. There's some contrast. There's some important contrast, but boy, there are numerous. These two stories line up in several ways.
Talking specifically about David and Bathsheba, right?
Right. You went through the story here just recently. Can you give us a rundown on David and Bathsheba?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, why don't we'll talk about it as a whole and then maybe take it bit by bit, and maybe we can see where Hamilton's story lines up with David's, and maybe also the points of divergence as well.
Yeah.
So you can find the story of David and Bathsheba in the Bible in 2 Samuel chapters 11 and 12. And essentially, David is not off at war in the spring, which is apparently the time when kings are supposed to be at war with one another.
Right.
It's wartime.
He's supposed to be at work.
Yeah.
And he's not. Right.
And he's not. And he's kind of prowling around on the rooftops and in his palace, and he notices a young, beautiful lady who is bathing on her rooftop way down below, and he apparently gets a little bit fixated. And so he's the king. He thinks he can have whatever he wants, and so he sends for her to come to his palace, and he sleeps with her. But there's a problem. Not only is that not okay in God's eyes, but she's married, actually. And her husband, Uriah, is out on the battlefield fighting right then and there. And maybe that wouldn't be a problem, except that, he thinks he can get away with it, but then she comes back and tells him that she's pregnant. And so then David tries to cover everything up, and it only spirals downhill from there. So, and I think there's lots of overlaps with the story of Alexander Hamilton. I mean, in the first place, this happens in the second act of the film,
right,
or of the musical. And maybe one could say that Hamilton wasn't where he should have been either. Because if you'll recall, his family tries to convince him to spend the summer with them because the man's just going nonstop. He's just working and working and working, and he wants to get his plan for the treasury through Congress. And his wife says, really, you need to come spend the summer with us. John Adams goes and spends the summer with his family. You need to do that. And Hamilton says, nope, you guys go. I've really got to stay here and do this. And that kind of leaves him a little bit vulnerable and exposed because he's by himself for the summer. Right.
In these ways, it's the same, but it's opposite, because David is supposed to be at work and he stays home. And when Alexander Hamilton is working from home, and he's supposed to be on vacation with his family. He
dives headlong into his work.
Right. But in both cases, you have an isolation. And when you talk about like you see this in like in recovery programs, the acronym HALT. HALT, stands for hungry, angry, lonely, tired.
Recipes for disaster.
Yes, they are. Yes, if you're trying to stop yourself from drinking again, or you're trying to just prevent temptation generally, which is where I see it from a pastoral point of view, you have this vulnerability that comes in when you're lonely. And so anytime, whether it's a traveling salesman out on the road or somebody that's just isolated from all the people who normally provide accountability, you have this vulnerability to temptation. And I guess I knew Alexander Hamilton's biography before I went into this because I'm kind of a history nerd.
Mm-hmm.
But even as the musical was unfolding, she's like, "Oh, please come away on vacation with me." And at first I was like, "Oh, don't go with her because her sister's going to be there." And Hamilton might have had kind of romantic intentions toward actually two of his wife's sisters, and one in the play specifically, the older sister, is held out as being kind of a good match for him intellectually, and there seems to be a connection there that they don't presume it's sexual necessarily, but it seems to be kind of a longing for one another.
Yes.
And so I'm like, oh, danger, danger! Don't go on vacation. But
that
then
was
I'm
my
like,
first thought too. Actually.
yeah. Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah.
And then he stays home, and again, my pastoral brain turns on. I'm like, oh no, don't stay home alone. That's dangerous. Don't do that either. That's a terrible idea.
Need to have a bro come hang out with you.
Yeah.
Or something.
Oh, yes. Somebody. Yes. You need to hire someone to stay right with you all the time because that's so dangerous, and not just for men, but for anybody. Like I said, hungry, angry, lonely, tired. That's just what a handy little acronym. If that's true of you, you need to halt and be aware that you're vulnerable to that sin. And so David should have been out with his men and wasn't.
Right.
With Hamilton, he should have been with his family.
Well, and
wasn't.
even more so, David probably knew, more than likely, we think, at the time he's strolling around the rooftops, this is not the time to be doing that. Mm-hmm. There are certain times of the day when people are going to be bathing, and of course there's no indoor plumbing, and things were a little bit different back then, and it's almost like he's kind of looking for trouble. And a similar thing happens to Hamilton, because in the musical, a young lady who's 10 or 11 years younger than him, actually, her name is Mariah Reynolds, she comes over and knocks on his door and tells him this story about how her life is really rough, and she's married and her husband's been abusing her and mistreating her and cheating on her and being a generally terrible guy.
And she's asking for money to.
I believe she wants to leave.
New York,
she wants to go to New York because this is in Philadelphia, correct?
Yes,
I'm pretty sure.
Yes,
his home in Philadelphia, and so she wants to leave, go to New York, and so he says nope. He feels very compassionate toward her and sympathetic toward this.
Which I was okay with up to that point.
Right.
Even loaning her money, I was like, okay, you're getting pretty involved, but
he made some critical mistakes.
Oh, yes, he did.
Because he followed her to her house.
Yeah.
And he gave her $30 that he had, which was, not an insignificant amount of money back then.
Yeah, that's some
couple $100 maybe.
Yeah.
But he goes to her house. Oh. And then, I
just died.
He said, I got to get back home or whatever. But, dude, it's too late. Like, you've already taken the first step.
But it's the same feeling I have when Bathsheba comes to the king's, chambers or whatever the wording is. Why? Don't invite her in. Don't invite her in. Right. Same thing with Hamilton. Don't go in her house. Don't go in her house. Yeah. Don't do that. No. At that point, the battle's almost lost.
Well, and of course, there's a musical number at this point about their affair, and I believe it's called "Say No to This," and all the cast, everybody, the chorus is pleading with Alexander, say no to this, say no to this.
Very plaintive at one point, very plaintive. No. That was voicing what was in my mind. Like, don't do that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, so historically, Alexander has this affair with Mariah Reynolds, and about a month in, her husband finds out about it, and there's some speculation that maybe he even knew about it from the start, and maybe she was even in on it a little bit, kind of
Yeah.
like some extortion, trying to
Yeah.
get some money.
Most
basically.
historians think that at some point, maybe not till the end, but at some point that she became complicit in the extortion.
Right.
That there was, you Alexander Hamilton need to pay us this large amount of money. And then after that, we're going to kind of keep blackmailing you and ask for these small loans.
Yeah.
And so I think originally it was $1,000, which I
But
can't imagine.
he ended up paying a little over 1,300. I think.
Yeah. There's another third of that came afterward, just where the husband kept coming back and asking for more money.
And essentially, it was hush hush money, but also it was like, hey, I don't really care if you do this. Like, go ahead and sleep with my wife. Whatever. We just keep paying us money and we'll be quiet about it. And he did this for a year.
But the cover up reminded me again of King David.
Absolutely.
Because King David has a similar kind of cover up with the husband of Bathsheba. His name is Uriah, but it's different. And so
Right, because
that.
Uriah is not part of that at all. But the problem in David's case is that Bathsheba ends up pregnant. Well, it's going to be pretty obvious that it's not her husband's baby, right? And so David actually calls his general, his name's Joab, and says, hey, send this soldier Uriah home. And David has him come to the palace, and I didn't realize this till I read the story again, but he actually gives a gift to Uriah.
Yeah.
It's almost like a bribe, except for he hasn't told Uriah what it's for.
Or maybe even just out of guilt.
Yeah, something like that. And he wines him and dines him, gives him booze and feasts with him, and then says, all right, hey, glad you're back home. Go on home and, sleep with your wife. Have a good old time. But Uriah is a noble man.
Yeah.
And he doesn't place his own interests above the interests of his kingdom and his nation and his compatriots, and he says he sleeps out on the stoop of the palace, essentially.
Yeah. And in this case, it's almost exactly opposite of Mr. Reynolds.
Right.
Where Mr. Reynolds not only is blackmailing Hamilton, Mr. Reynolds was involved in several other schemes.
Nefarious
Right.
things.
And so he was in all sorts of illegal money activities, at several points, which is part of how the Hamilton issue gets exposed, because this guy's, I think he was actually on trial at one point. So,
Right.
So yeah,
and for
you got
Hamilton,
Uriah in the Bible, who just upstanding character all the way through, maybe even above and beyond the call of duty there.
Yeah, for Hamilton, it doesn't get exposed till a few years after this affair had happened. But for David, he has Uriah there, and he's like, dang it, he didn't go sleep with his wife. So he tries to, booze him up even more and make him, hopefully stagger home drunk, and it just doesn't work.
Right.
Uriah is not willing to go and be with his wife while the rest of his fellow countrymen are out fighting a war. He's like, why do I deserve to be home right now? And so then David feels like, well, I have no other recourse. I just need to have the guy murdered.
Oh, that's, yeah. Wow. In for a penny, in for a pound. Yeah. Okay.
But of course, it wouldn't look good if David just executed him on the spot. So he sends Uriah back to Joab with a note that contains his own demise. And the note that Uriah gives to Joab says, put Uriah on the front line, call all the troops back, make sure that he dies in battle.
Yeah. And see, but this is where the more I thought about it, the more layers, because that note and the letter that Reynolds sends to Hamilton saying, hey, I know what's going on, you better pony up some cash. There's these correspondences that are in both stories, and they're different. They're not the same. But the correlation, like, you just start lining up all the different features, and we haven't named them all, and we'll name some more yet. But that's just one more thing. I was like, man, okay, and then there's a letter, and in this case, Uriah is handling the letter that has instructions for his own death.
Yeah, and so Uriah ends up dying, and actually Joab kind of has a dumb military strategy, and it doesn't go very well. And he sends a messenger back to David, and he's like, so tell him the bad news first about how this battle didn't go well because I was dumb. And then when he gets mad about it, tell him, hey, by the way, Uriah's dead. And that'll just perk David right up. He'll just be happy as a clam.
Right.
And, talking about the similarities between these stories, David has Uriah murdered. Hamilton doesn't do anything that extreme, but in a way, he kind of figuratively or symbolically murders his family a little bit because
Well, he does right up. I don't feel like we're quite at that point yet because at this point both Hamilton and David have covered up their sin.
yes,
Okay, the blackmail payments have been paid. Uriah has been killed. The sin's covered up, and no one's ever going to know. Right, because David takes Bathsheba as a wife. Look, it's all good. But both of them do get exposed, and in the exposure for Hamilton, let's talk about that first because that goes to your point you were just about to make.
For sure.
That he does do harm. It's not like Hamilton's hands are clean. He in getting himself out of a pickle really injures specifically his wife.
So you're the history guy in the room. Why don't you tell us really briefly kind of why it came to light or surfaced in the first place that Hamilton might have had this affair?
Yeah, Reynolds, the husband of the woman that Hamilton had an affair with, he was caught in a deal. It was a financial transaction that was fraudulent, and there was connection because as they investigated him, they're coming up with all of these payments coming from Alexander Hamilton, who at the time was Secretary of the Treasury. Mm-hmm. And so if it's possible that this con artist guy, this guy that's scamming people and trying to steal money, if this guy is getting money from the Secretary of Treasury, that might be government money. And so in reality, it's actually a few different people that come and accuse Hamilton. They come and approach him, and
which one of them was James Monroe.
Yeah,
right?
I believe so.
And then a couple other delegates.
Yeah,
but in the theatrical version,
they keep things streamlined.
Right.
They already have some characters on stage. They use those characters. They use Thomas Jefferson
and Burr and Madison, I think.
Yes, yeah. And so, but regardless, he's confronted. And when he's confronted, he's like, okay, well, I could lie and be defensive and say, I don't know what you're talking about. But instead what he does is like, okay, well, I'll just show you that I didn't do anything illegal with government money. And by doing that, he has to then expose and admit to his immoral affair and the fact that he was blackmailed. And so he shows that to them, and he says, okay, now if I show you that I didn't break the law, will you keep my information private, which they don't do. That information in reality, in real history, that information ends up getting used against Hamilton and starts to leak out through the gossip networks. And
he could have been okay with that. He could have just let that be the consequence for his actions.
Mm-hmm.
But he maybe felt that his party, the Federalist Party, was kind of turning on him, and he wanted to, let's say, maybe keep his prospects open a little bit so that he could maybe still serve politically.
Well, he wanted to justify himself.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so, at the expense of his family, he decides to go on the offensive and writes something that is now referred to as the Reynolds pamphlet, which is like a 100-page booklet describing in detail this illicit affair that he had.
Yeah.
I mean, I felt so bad for Eliza. I was just like, way to drag your family completely through the mud. And that's what I was getting at earlier, is that it's almost like he symbolically killed them a little bit.
Yeah. Well, he does harm, and understand too. We're talking about 200 years ago, and more than 200 years ago, and so people's public reputation and the idea of honor
and shame.
That honor culture was different than what we have now. I mean, it was changing. It was in the process of changing from an honor culture to something more like what we have now. But they still had a lot of that, and especially his wife coming from a rich family, she kind of had maybe a little bit more of that aristocratic. How can you embarrass us by publicly admitting it? Now, the public attention was almost as bad as the original offense, and so that was very hurtful. And he was willing to let her be hurt in order to clear his name. But there's another point of comparison, the righteous indignation that Alexander Hamilton has on. I have not committed a crime with government money. well, yeah, but you had an affair with another man's wife, you know.
Right.
But this hypocritical righteous indignation is exactly what we see in David's story too.
Because he gets exposed in a different way. Well, God knows
Yes.
what happened.
Yes.
And God has a prophet named Nathan who comes to David and starts out by telling David a story, right? He says, you know, there's a guy who has a whole bunch of sheep. He's really rich and wealthy. There's another guy who's kind of poor, and he has this one little lamb. And the rich guy has a friend who's coming into town and says, hey, poor man, give me your lamb. I'm taking it. We're going to kill it for the feast. And David is just outraged. How dare that person, you know, you show me that person right now. Like they're going to pay for what they've done. And Nathan says, David, that's you. That's exactly what you did. You took another man's wife. You know, you had everything. And he kind of says that to him. God gave you everything. The kingship, multiple wives, as much as we might not feel great about that today.
Yeah, no.
But, you know, money, wealth, fame, power, was that not enough for you?
Yeah.
And we kind of see that theme in Hamilton as well. Angelica, that is Alexander Hamilton's sister-in-law, the sister of his wife, Eliza Schuyler, she tells him, you know, when they kind of first meet each other, they talk about this word satisfied and how they're both people who have a difficult time being satisfied.
Right.
And you can interpret that in different ways, like intellectually or just with their pursuits, the things that they want in life.
Their appetites and all sorts of things.
But she is totally not on board with what he ends up doing to Eliza. And she actually comes back to him later in the musical and says, I hope you're satisfied.
Yeah.
I hope you can live with yourself for what you've done.
And in that exchange, he thinks she's come back to see him because he's feeling sorry for himself. And she's like, no, I'm here for my sister. Yeah. And, you know, my sister is this, you know, ideal person. You're never going to meet somebody as nice and all these other superlatives. And look at what you've done to her. And so he has this terrible, you know, Hamilton has this terrible exposure that he causes, where King David gets exposed by the prophet Nathan.
Yes,
and so they both have their sins exposed, and I believe that both of them, you know, have a period of repentance. But the repentance to forgiveness arc is a little bit different between the two of them. And so let's talk about King David. With King David, he's confronted by Nathan and
almost immediately, he basically says, you're right. Like, I've done wrong. I have sinned. And Nathan tells him right then and there, like, God has forgiven you for this.
But the consequences, you can be forgiven, but the consequences are not necessarily done being played out.
And that's probably good to just point out from a ministerial perspective, you know. You can totally be forgiven, but also sometimes you got to live up to the things that you've done, and sometimes there's going to be consequences to pay for that. And in this case, you know, regrettably, the child that David and Bathsheba has is born, but Nathan actually tells David this child is not going to make it.
Yeah.
And for a week, this child is sick but still living, and David is just praying on his hands and knees daily for this child. But he's repentant. In fact, Psalm 51, one of the most famous psalms in the entire Psalter, is supposed to be about this period of time in David's life where he is just absolutely repentant and seeking forgiveness from God. And God does forgive him, but the child ends up dying. And it's sad and it's tragic, but also at the same time, David is accepting of that. He, you know, when this child dies, his servants are afraid that he's just going to go ballistic. And he says, what's done is done. Like, God has taken this away from me, and like I have to move on with my life now. And
he gets up. What's the phrasing there? He gets up and he washes his face or something like that.
Exactly. And then he eats some food again because he's been fasting for the week.
But that death is an important part of the process of David learning from the terrible sin that he's committed, the grief of it. It's not that the child's life was like direct payment or something like that. It's not. I don't
No.
think God works like that. But the child did die, and David's grief is part of his learning the consequences of his sin. Now with Hamilton, both in real life and in the musical, he has this affair for about a year, and then time passes, it's exposed, then some more time passes. But during the time after that, his wife has been shamed, and there's a couple things going on there, both with his wife Elizabeth, who's called Eliza in the play, and also with Hamilton's son, yet another point of comparison. There's a child of each of these individuals that's involved in this narrative. So talk to me about Eliza and Hamilton's son, Philip.
Yeah, so that's their oldest child. They had 8 children, as a matter of fact. And his son, Philip, his dad, Alexander, his name's kind of getting dragged through the mud a little bit by all these dignitaries saying, like, what a scoundrel, basically. And he feels like he has to defend his father's honor a little bit. And so he ends up getting into a duel, which is a theme in this particular movie.
Yes.
Most people probably know, or if you don't, that's how Alexander Hamilton dies.
Yeah.
Very famously is
he
in a
himself
duel.
will die in a duel.
Yes. But I didn't know this. His son was in a duel almost at the exact same place, actually. 3 years apart. They dueled in the same area. And Alexander Hamilton basically says, well, here's what you need to do. Point your gun in the air. Like, you'll both just be men of honor, and you can get out of this whole thing, basically.
Because most duels don't end up with people killing each other.
No.
Most of them, it's, well, we're going to negotiate our way out, or we're going to shoot into the ground.
It's all kind of for show, and it's about honor.
Yeah.
It seems kind of weird and foreign to us today.
Yeah.
But
the guy that shot Philip actually there were 2 young men, Philip and another one, who both confronted him. And the guy actually did 2 duels.
I did not know that.
And was in the one with Philip was the second one. And the first one, Eker, I think is his name, and Philip's friend both shot and both quote unquote missed. So they
whether intentionally or
unintentionally. I mean, who knows? At 10 paces, I mean, good grief! I think it'd be relatively easy to hit somebody if you wanted to hit them.
Probably, although those pistols back then weren't the most reliable.
It's hard to say how well they could really aim, especially under pressure. Who knows? But they both missed. And so then later the same day or the next day, he then duels with Philip and shoots him. The wound gets infected.
Miss.
Yeah, Eker ends up killing him. And so Alexander Hamilton's son dies in a duel. And this is the eldest child, and in the play, the only child that's represented on stage.
Yes,
of Elizabeth and Alexander.
And it's obviously devastating.
Yes,
I mean, who would it not devastate, right? Their child has just died in a duel, especially something that probably could have been prevented. Although, talk about analogies to this and the David and Bathsheba story, Alexander Hamilton in the musical tells Philip before the duel to take a man's life that is something you can't shake. And David actually ends up taking a man's life. And I thought about that particular comparison. But they're both distraught. Their oldest child has died, and yet they need to find a way to move on and to cope with this. And so the way that's portrayed in the musical is basically they move uptown and they get out of the spotlight for a while and kind of just have some healing.
Yeah.
They take walks together, they talk, they stay out of the public spotlight a little bit.
And one thing I appreciate as a contrast, in the biblical narrative of King David, we don't really get to know Bathsheba's mind about any of this. She is very much a background character. And it's important that David have his heart expressed in the Psalms and in the narrative itself, and we get to see how David felt about it, how David was eventually reconciled to God, how he was repentant and understood the gravity of his sin. But in the musical play, we get a really nice insight into both the perpetrator and the victim.
Yes.
We get to know Eliza's point of view to some degree, which is speculative on the part of Lin-Manuel Miranda. I mean, he's kind of reading into what she might have been thinking and saying, but he interprets that as she's deliberately going to burn some of the letters that might have been favorable and helped in public opinion toward
Right.
Hamilton.
She actually says there's so many there's so many pieces of music and lyrics in this particular musical, but she says early on, like, I'm part of your narrative now. Like, our stories are joined together.
Yeah.
But then after this affair has been exposed, this is actually before their son dies.
Right.
There's a song called Burn, and she basically says, I'm erasing myself from the narrative.
Right.
Historians are going to have to speculate about how I was feeling during this time. And if
Much
there was,
like we have to do with Bathsheba.
yeah, and if there was some way that maybe you could have been redeemed, it's not going to be available to you. And that's the unfortunate thing about someone like Bathsheba. You have to feel for her because we don't know what she was thinking. You know what I mean?
We don't even know how complicit she was because David's king.
Can you really say no to that?
Was this, was she forced or was she in on this? Was she a conspirator? I mean, you might have your opinion, but I don't think the biblical text tells us one way or the other.
Yeah, it doesn't make it implicit, at least.
Right.
Or explicit, I should say. But then at the end of Hamilton, Eliza says, I'm putting myself back in the narrative now because there has been this healing process that their son's death was kind of the catalyst for.
Yeah.
And they come back together, and there's this beautiful part where the chorus is singing about how their love is being rekindled and that they're going through the unimaginable right now with everything that they're dealing with in their lives. And they say this line, forgiveness. Yeah. Can you imagine? And that's tearjerker right there.
And on stage, the two actors playing husband and wife, playing Alexander and Elizabeth, they, at that point, she reaches over and holds his hand.
She reaches out to grab him.
Oh my goodness, that just wrecks me emotionally. And I think that you see now not just the comparison between Elizabeth or Eliza and Bathsheba, but you also see the comparison between Elizabeth and God.
Yeah.
That God is written back into the narrative. Maybe David was kind of, he was king. He was kind of calling his own shots and whatever. And you can see, reading through the Psalms and even in the narrative itself, how now God is coming back into David's story as a priority, and he's reconciled to his God. After repenting and grieving and going through this process, and so the death of a son is pivotal in both of those processes, and then that reconciliation happens.
And there's certainly some redemption in both of these stories. I mean, Bathsheba and David have another son named Solomon.
Yeah, he turns out to be a big deal.
He ends up becoming king after David, even though he's not David's firstborn.
No.
And likewise with Alexander and Elizabeth. She goes on to live like another 50 years after he dies, because he dies pretty young in this duel. He's in his 40s. Yeah. And by all accounts, she went through these painstaking processes to collect all of his letters and create a biography about him and really tell his story and commemorate his life. And she even does something that they make a big deal about at the very end of the musical, where she builds an orphanage because Alexander Hamilton was an orphan. Yeah. And it's almost a way of her commemorating him, and it's a legacy sort of thing. It's almost like, they're still together even in his death. Like, she's just so committed to him steadfastly.
Yeah. It's a very redemptive story in both cases. You have in the, just the cherished story of King David recovering from that terrible sin. I think a lot of people, even people who've never committed adultery, I feel like they can identify with the gravity of feeling your sin and feeling the consequences of it, and knowing that God can forgive you and love you again. That's so critical.
Well, and almost everyone probably knows someone in their family or a friend who maybe has gone through this before. I mean, I have personal cases in my life of family and friends who have been through bouts of adultery, and talk about wreck things. I mean, you're not just ruining your own life. You're really messing with a bunch of other people's lives. And so it's a big deal. And maybe one final thing to say about Hamilton is there's this line that gets stated by George Washington, who he kind of serves that a little bit as the Nathan of the film.
Yeah.
Not as it pertains to the Mariah Reynolds affair, but he's kind of like Alexander's voice of wisdom.
Well, he's a father figure.
Yeah, he's teaching him and trying to show him a better way to do life. And he tells Alexander, history has its eyes on you. Mm-hmm. And it's not only a word of warning to Alexander, but to us as the audience. Yeah. And we should take it as such. History has its eyes on you. People know about this, unfortunate period of Alexander Hamilton's life, just like people know about this unfortunate period of King David's life. Yeah. And, we don't want our story to be written that way,
No, because it's all so avoidable.
Yes.
We're all sinners. We all have terrible regrets, and we should mourn our sin, but so many of our sins are so avoidable. And so, that would be wise to learn from the pain of others, both King David and Alexander Hamilton. Let's not repeat the mistakes that they made.
And yet, thank God for forgiveness, and mercy and grace, and that sin doesn't have to have the final say. It doesn't get to be the period. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Any other final words?
No, I think that's pretty good. Hamilton, you should see it.
Yeah, definitely. Read your Bible and go watch a movie where someone forgives somebody else and have a good cry.
You'll feel a lot better about yourself.
Thank you.